Yaya Fanusie is the Director of Analysis here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. He spent 7 years as both an economic and counterterrorism analyst in the CIA, where he regularly briefed White House policymakers, U.S. military personnel, and federal law enforcement. In 2009, he spent 3 months in Afghanistan, providing analytic support to senior military officials. I'm proud to call him my colleague and eager to talk with him about some of the issues and controversies he's been working on and thinking about here at FDD and today on Foreign Podicy. Either the U.S. enforces some rules in the world or there are no rules.
Every U.S. president has tried to diminish tension with Russia, has reached out to the Russians. Most of those have failed, especially when Vladimir Putin became the leader.
They're still killing guys who joined the jihad in 1979 or 1980 or 1981 who are still in the game.
We are seeing a ramp up in North Korean cyber capabilities over the last decade.
Iran is basically putting forth these claims of nuclear innocence, that they are doing nothing wrong, that there are no violations, and that's just factually not correct.
I am fearful for what happens to Turkey now. If you thought that it was dangerous that a coup might have toppled this democracy, think about what this very autocratic man might do.
Yaya, thanks for making the journey from your office to our studio, just down the hall from the kitchen here at FDD HQ.
Thanks, Cliff. I'm glad I made it all the way over here.
It's very good of you to do so. In recent years, you've been focusing on subjects that are both complex and cutting edge, such as cryptocurrencies and blockchains. And what little I know about these subjects you've taught me. I've learned from you. But today I want to start at least by asking you about your journey, not just professionally, but spiritually, intellectually, and in other ways. Maybe start with a little bit about where you grew up geographically and the intellectual and cultural environment, since that's also a subject we're going to explore in greater depth.
Absolutely. Well, it all started, I'm a Californian, born and raised in California. I was raised in a not particularly religious home. My father is from West Africa, from Sierra Leone, came here in the 1960s for college. My mother, an African-American, born and raised in Los Angeles. And so I grew up mostly in Southern California. My mother from a Christian family. My dad was actually from a Christian family, but was very non-religious when he came here in the 60s. I would say my journey can be captured by 4 stages or 4 periods. My teenage years, I was really influenced by, I would say, we didn't have the term SJW back then in the 90s, in the social justice warriors. But I would say in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, I was, really impacted by, sort of the hip hop political social consciousness and militancy of that age. So when I went to college, I went to UC Berkeley, studied economics. And I was really influenced by that. I would say I actually had, some militant ideas as a young Berkeley freshman in my early days, and that was sort of my first stage, the roots of my sort of early intellectual development, I'd say. But that shifted. That shifted actually during Berkeley. In my years at Berkeley, I soon became more spiritual, less political. I went on my own journey of looking, asking the questions of life and how did I fit into the universe. And that spiritual journey led me to Islam, and I converted to Islam right before I graduated. And my discovery or my exploration of Islam was a very private one. So I'd say I sort of actually went from, being aware of a lot of the geopolitical militant rhetoric that even jihadists would use. I sort of had engaged them before I came to Islam. If you look at, I would say before I was spiritual, I sort of regarded a figure like Malcolm X in those days for his sort of political militancy, not the religious side of it. And then when I became Muslim, when I converted, that sort of rhetoric didn't appeal to me so much because of the spiritual message. And that journey was one of reading the Quran. The English translation of it. So that was sort of the second stage. I don't know if I should just stop there.
Well, this is a personal question, how did your parents, not least your father, who's from West Africa, and I spent, as you know, 3 years in West Africa, or in Africa, based in West Africa. What was their response to your doing that? How did they feel about that?
Yeah, it was very interesting. They both had very open responses. By that time, this was toward the end of my career, my Berkeley career. My mom had actually become born again Christian. So she had sort of returned. My parents had divorced. So by that time, she was actually going to church more. And I actually remember one time she figured out something was going on with me. She asked about my, sort of my religious leanings. And I actually mentioned to her, I said, I've sort of been reading the Quran and exploring this. And she had a very open approach to it. She said, she was more concerned with me believing in God. That was sort of her, even though she was sort of born again, that she wasn't concerned about, she wasn't against Islam. And this was in 1996, 97. My father, do whatever you want. He was, even though he wasn't religious himself, he was very open, and so I had no real issues except for some, a little bit of awkwardness with some family members who were maybe more strident Christians in the beginning, but there was a mutual respect. So I didn't have a big issue with my conversion with the family.
Now, you're African American. I point that out not because you don't know it, but because we're doing a podcast, people can't necessarily tell. Did you ever think that, the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan?
So no, because the early years, so like when I was really interested in Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, I would say, had some appeal. But it was more because of the political stances and the political rhetoric, the nationalist rhetoric. But I wasn't attracted to the ideology, in the full ideology. So when I started looking at Islam, it was a very spiritually focused, and it wasn't racial at all. In fact, I can remember actually reading the Quran at one point in my college, my apartment, and reading one verse which said something to the effect of, distinction or honor is not in distinct, and honor only comes in from righteousness, not from tribe and from color or anything like that. And I remember actually reading that and reflecting on, this is counter to what I believed years ago as a teenager. This idea of not thinking about race as my sole identity, or there really was a transformation in my thinking that honestly my engagement with the Quran sort of helped with. So thinking more about my place in the world as a human really developed as I engaged the Quran, as I sort of, started looking at Muhammad's life, Muhammad the Prophet. These things sort of almost erased the sort of the narrow-mindedness that I had earlier, and my engagement with the Nation of Islam. I saw the Nation of Islam as, the ideology didn't appeal to me as a seeker, as a Muslim, someone really looking at the sources and not thinking so much about the cultural baggage and the political and the SJW narrative. Was just resonated less with me. I will say though that it's interesting because, and I don't know how deep we want to go into the history, but there's an interesting dynamic which happened with my conversion, which is I read a Quran. My mother, who was raised in LA but born in New York, her biological father, in the 50s, 60s, joined the Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. Now, she didn't grow up with him. She didn't know, she was raised in California. And when he died in the early 90s, my mom flew from LA to New York, went to the funeral. And I don't really know the extent of his engagement with the nation. Maybe he was in it for a few years. He had other kids. But when they had a funeral, they had an Islamic funeral for him. And my mom was given a copy of the Quran and another sort of Islamic book from her uncle, her biological uncle. And they just gave it to her, because of the funeral, and then she brought it back. And so interestingly, when she came back to California, she gave me that Quran. She said, you can have, this was, again, I was in high school. I wasn't really into religion. She said, you can have this Quran and this book, The Sayings of Muhammad. And I kept that book on my shelf. for a few years, for maybe 4, 5, 6 years before I really started looking at it. So it's interesting that it was, that sort of that black nationalist NOI of the 50s and 60s sort of indirectly impacted my exposure later to Islam proper, or whatever you want to call it.
And we'll get into what you call it. But I know you don't identify yourself either as Shia or Sunni. And I kind of wonder, don't you have to be one or the other? I mean, this is a split or division in Islam that's persisted for 1,400 years. Are there many imams who would encourage you not to identify with one or the other?
This is to answer that last question. Many would, by default, would probably say that I am Sunni. Other people would say, some imams might say, well, you're not following the sort of the Shia scholarship. You're not, in terms of how you practice and what you do. You're not going to a Shia mosque. They would say that by default you're Sunni. And in some ways, I might say that as a technicality, but I'd be I would sort of strongly rebut that characterization, because when I came to the religion, it was reading sort of the key Islamic source, right? Reading the Quran, learning about Muhammad's life. And, I soon discovered that the split between Sunni and Shia started as a political debate, political fight immediately after Muhammad's death. And when I realized that, okay, what attracts me, what I'm sort of signing up for, isn't really this political fight over the leadership after the Prophet's life. Should it have been Ali or should it have been Abu Bakr? Okay, Abu Bakr got it, was the caliph, and then Ali came much later. But that really isn't the essence of what I cared about. I was really and am interested in what I would characterize God's message to man that went to Muhammad or came to Muhammad. And what does that mean? So I see the Sunni Shia split, which of course impacted how Islam developed, how a classical Islamic scholarship grew and manifested, and of course how empires expanded. And, the whole idea of the ulama is based in these, the Islamic scholars. Right. The learned. But I think you tap into a really interesting question, which is, what is my relationship to classical Islamic scholarship? And I think this is key to some of what we're going to discuss, because I would say that if you're a Muslim and you want to respect the Islamic tradition, you have to have a respect for the scholarship that came down before. Centuries of scholars who sort of looked at these Islamic sources and made judgments. But there's a difference between respecting that body of knowledge and being locked into it, because what a lot of if you look at let's say the four schools of thought in the Sunni, right, in the Sunni understanding of Islam, it's pretty clear that you have an established authority, a body of knowledge, and that interpretation only goes so far. You're really boxed in, and those who sort of, I would say, overemphasize the classical Islamic scholarship, would not allow for a lot of interpretation, would not allow, there's this idea of the doors of ijtihad, which is the idea that you can judge and make reasoning about the religion and interpretation, that those doors have been closed with those, and for practical.
Muslims agree with that. That's
Correct.
Been a controversy. We know people who have objected to that is a dogma that must be obeyed. But yes, but you're right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, getting back to your question, I think, on a very practical level, I can't define myself as fully as Sunni, because I'm not because I did not sign up for a political I didn't sign up with a political party when I came to this religion.
Right. You were looking for it in a more spiritual sense, but you make a very important point that I hadn't quite thought of before, which is that the Sunni-Shia split is, as you say, political. What does that mean? What's the most basic, fundamental question in political science? Who governs? And on what basis? What's legitimacy? That's really the question being asked. Is it on the basis of your heritage? Is it on the basis of your scholarship? Is it on the basis of what the worshippers, the adherents, the ummah, the Muslim community, what they want? How do they decide? How do they express it? It is a question that we have right now. Who decides who rules in any country? Democratic rule? Monarchical rule? Rule as in Iran by the jurisprudence, by the scholars of Islam who have made themselves into, I would argue, an elite that cannot be questioned. It's a very, very basic question. It's a question people have been asking for 1,400 years, probably longer, but it became but in a way, it really came to a head with that, and it's a conflict that has never been resolved. All right, moving from that, a little bit, how you became as a Berkeley graduate and a Muslim convert, how you found yourself working for the CIA. Probably not the usual route for Berkeley Muslim graduates. I mean, probably not a huge crowd of you guys, right? Am I right on that? Good guess. Okay.
Absolutely. I think that was the second half of my journey, right? So first I discovered Islam as a very private, religious experience. After I graduated from Berkeley, I got a Fulbright scholarship and I studied in Ghana for a year, did a research project in Ghana for a year. And that was interesting because this was a few months after I converted. So I went from this very private process, in Berkeley, the Bay Area, California, and then going off to Ghana, trying to figure out, where do I go for Friday prayers?
Ghana is not a particularly Muslim country. People may not know this about Africa, but Africa,
that's right.
That part of Africa, I spent time there. That's more Christian. You have to go further north to get to the Muslim areas.
Yes. So that was my exposure I was exposed to Islam and Muslims outside of the United States. I was exposed to different interpretations. First of all, the West Africans, and there was a variety because I was in, there were people, I went to the college campus for Friday prayers, and there were some people who maybe were more strict, maybe influenced by the Salafist interpretations. There were others who were more flexible. And then I actually had a unique experience because I had the opportunity to make Hajj when I was in Ghana. That also exposed me. I remember being on Hajj and the pilgrimage.
Most people know the pilgrimage to Mecca. Okay, yeah.
Right. Making the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I, as a young guy, actually went with a delegation of Ghanaians. I basically, because I wasn't in the United States, I had to go with the Ghanaian Muslims. So I noticed differences. I noticed how women, the Ghanaian women, and how they practice Islam and their visibility was much different than when I was in the shops in Mecca and Medina seeing the Saudis. So at this age, I was really seeing these differences, different interpretations. I remember going to London before I went to Ghana and going to different mosques and seeing again different interpretations. So I think I was exposed to different voices within
right,
because,
and which a lot of people are not. They think of Islam as one thing.
Exactly.
And this is something we're going to explore more in this conversation is the various interpretations of Islam. And there were changes. I mean, when I lived in West Africa for 3 years in the 1980s, I would say there were very few Salafis, very little Wahhabism back at that point introduced. Muslims in those days in Africa have strong Sufi influence. Of course, in places like Timbuktu, they had shrines and great libraries, which the Salafi jihadists, when they got there, broke down, burned, slammed, considered it un-Islamic. I mean, what they were telling the Africans is your religion has marinated in African culture for too long and is no longer true Islam, and we're not going to let you continue with this sort of heresy. We're going to teach you one way or another what true Islam is all about. Of course, that was also the case in Anwar province in Iraq as well, and parts of Afghanistan that you know. All right, so talking about so you get to the CIA.
That's a big
I love digression. We do a lot of digression on these shows. That's okay.
Right. Well, so yes, so. When I got back, I finally got settled in one particular location when I came back to the U.S. And I think, I solidified my Muslim American identity when I got back to the U.S. I went to graduate school at Columbia University.
Did you feel more American coming back from Africa?
I'd say so. I think that experience, well, you know what? When I came back, I think I was trying to figure out what does it mean to be an American Muslim, honestly, because I didn't, it was, I was having this sort of foreign experience, and coming back to the States, it took me a while to sort of find friends, to find community, to find folks who I think were more, I found other people who were more maybe balanced in their outlook. Because I knew I didn't want to do what the Saudis were doing, and I just felt like now is time for me to figure out as an American what should I latch on to, or how should I live the religion. And so that happened. I think I sort of reconciled that during that experience, and as I was leaving grad school, sort of figuring out what I wanted to do. I went through a few different things, but eventually, I got a degree in a master's in international affairs. And so I got an opportunity when I talked to someone about the CIA, and I had never thought about the intelligence community. I went to graduate school right before 9/11, so I was not thinking about counterterrorism. But when someone came up to me and sort of explained that what it was like to be an intelligence analyst, I joined the CIA not for counterterrorism. I actually joined as an economic analyst focused on Africa. That was, that made sense. That was my background. And it was, incidentally, it was the London bombing, which the 2005 London underground bombing by 4 West British Muslims. Most of them, the 3 of them at least, were born in Britain. They were all raised in Britain. One was a convert. That happened in 2005 at the first several months of my career at the agency. And when it happened, for me, that was an important moment, because before, as an economic analyst doing my thing and working on my particular issues, terrorism, even though I was concerned about it, like most people, I still saw it as Al-Qaeda is over there. This is a Middle East sort of problem. And then when this happened, and this was when it first happened, we didn't know necessarily the Al-Qaeda links when it first happened of the perpetrators. So when it first happened, I was thinking, wow, these guys are young Muslims in their 20s. Born in the West. I understand them. I understand that identity. And I started to think about, well, here I am at the CIA. Maybe I should be working on something else. Maybe I should be trying to stop this. And it was just that natural inclination, that curiosity. I talked to some coworkers, what is the CT fight like? I really was not thinking about it when I was first hired.
Right.
So that led me to work counterterrorism. I was assigned later to the National Counterterrorism Center, which is an interagency organization, folks coming from all parts of the intelligence community. And I worked on an Al-Qaeda team, or a team looking at Al-Qaeda and Sunni extremists and threats to the homeland. And one of the first areas that I worked on was the threat coming from Al-Qaeda inspired extremists and terrorists, folks that were in the U.S. and figures like ideologues like Anwar alAwlaqi and the like.
I want to talk more about him, but soon. But let me just go one step at a time. Now, look, there are people who would say, a Muslim in the CIA, how can we trust him? And there are also Muslims, and you've written about this, who would disapprove of Muslims working in America's national security establishment. They'd say such an affiliation is, to use your word, at odds with Islam. And you put it this way, and I think this is, I want to read this and quote you and let you elaborate on it, because I think you said it well. Many Muslims see America's national security focus on violent Islamist groups as evidence of an anti-Islam conspiracy. And many non-Muslims assume that religiously adherent Muslims must sympathize with the jihadist cause. I think you've put it very well. That is the challenge. That was I would imagine that was a part of the challenge for you, both in your terms of your professional life and your private life, your religious life.
Yeah. And what helped me, and it didn't happen overnight. Remember, when I went into the CIA, I wasn't thinking counterterrorism. Right. so I wasn't. Of course, I thought that would be possible, but that wasn't my intention. So working at the agency, and first of all, getting a clearer understanding of foreign policy, seeing the threats that we face as Americans, sort of from the inside, understanding the nature of, getting beyond the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, and seeing the true nature of threats and the difficulty of foreign policy, I think gave me a more nuanced understanding of the fight against terrorism.
So you've also written, and I'm perhaps jumping ahead in terms of your thinking, but I think it's important, and I want to make sure Muslim Americans should be at the forefront of establishing the security of their neighbors. You've written it that it's necessary for Muslims to take ownership of the fight against terrorism. I want you to elaborate on that. I think these are important ideas that I don't think a lot of people say, that Muslims must be at the forefront. And it's also at variance with what I would call the politically correct view that, and we'll talk more about this, but I've got to bring it in, that all this terrorism, it either has nothing to do with Islam, or it's a totally false, twisted version of Islam it's perverse. And you're saying, well, no, neither. It's not. That's not quite precise.
Yes.
We're talking about an ideology that is theologically based, and you're coming to terms with it. Because if you say that it has nothing to do with Islam, then Muslims can say, well, this has nothing to do with me. I'm going to sit on the side. You guys, good luck, because it has nothing to do with me. You're saying, no, this engages us. So this has to engage us.
Yes. Because the first thing is that within the Muslim community, right, and I can talk about the Muslim American community in particular, right, there is a very, let me put it like this. The IQ on terrorism, jihadism, and even foreign policy has to be increased. The dialogue about these issues, right, is so, it's colored by things unrelated to the actual threat and the things that are happening in the world. So when most people think about the conversation about terrorism, they're thinking about some sort of political debates. They're thinking about pundits on cable news. They're not taking a measured and a sober look at what's happening in the world. For a good example, when I first became a counterterrorism analyst, I didn't broadcast it. I didn't go to the mosque and say, "Hi, I'm Yaya. I work for the CIA. I'm here to pray."
Here to help you.
I'm here to help you. No, I mean, I was a as a practicing Muslim, I did what I would always do. I did share it with friends that I trusted, Muslim friends that I trusted. And the thing that I learned when I shared this, there were very bright, intelligent, college educated, friends that I respect, who, when I told them, I'm going to start working counterterrorism, I had friends who said, that 9/11 thing, that you don't really think that Muslims did that, right? I mean, I had smart people tell me that, right? And so, of course, the good thing was that now I could say, look, I could look them in the eye and say, yes, that was Osama. This is not some made up thing, right? So Muslims. So first of all, we have to really get a good sense of what's happening in the world. I'm not going to jump ahead, but I know just even the idea of what are we facing. There is a jihadist movement,
You're willing to use that word, jihadist?
I use that. To me, it's precise, it's clear. It actually tells you how people view jihad. I think, you're using jihad. I mean, you can say that jihad is very broad, and you can, people talk about that all the time. But jihadist is very clear. Violent jihad is something that's incumbent upon people to impose a certain sort of political Islamic state. That is a movement that is happening. Al-Qaeda was that. ISIS. I mean, this is something that is very real, and I think a lot of my co-religionists don't want to look at it.
And not just your co-religious. Look, the last podcast we did, a very interesting podcast. Steve Hadley, former national security advisor to President Bush, Nancy Lindbergh of U.S. Institute for Peace, a report from the U.S. Institute for Peace. It's all about extremism. They cannot bring themselves to put an adjective before the word extremism. They cannot do it. They know, we all know what we're talking about, kind of. It's a movement to extremism. It sees an Islamic state in the future, but you can't say They don't say jihadist. They don't say jihad. They don't say militant Islam. They don't want to deal with the idea, you correct me if I'm wrong in any part of this, that there is a movement within Islam, within the Ummah, within the world of Islam, which is very varied in all sorts of ways, that focuses specifically on the idea that jihad is a 21st century obligation. And by jihad, we mean not inner struggle. We mean by the sword. We need to create the Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and it must be global. And that means we must take down the disbelievers, the unbelievers, the infidels, all of them who oppose us. They are all by definition enemies of Islam and therefore must be fought starting now. Yeah. That's basically right. And you've talked about this. And I think what you suggested is, that was a 7th century interpretation of Islam. It is not necessarily what should be the 21st century interpretation of Islam for all sorts of reasons.
And that's important because, often, so we have to get past this barrier of not wanting to use certain language because, it reflects a very simplistic view. And here are the traps that happen when we don't really want to name things. For example, even the way we talk about terrorism, like everyone's against terrorism. Most people, 99% of people, everyone says terrorism is bad. If you don't talk about the jihadist movement, then you leave an opening for people to talk about being rebels and being insurgents and fighting against Assad, the Assad regime. And they're not, some of these groups are against ISIS. But so there's this gateway of fighting, maybe fighting an invader, fighting an intruder, quote unquote, or fighting a corrupt government where you can be a rebel. And sometimes because we're not focused on the movement and who these folks are, people sort of leave an opening and the jihadist movement creeps in. A lot of these rebel groups, maybe they're not doing a suicide bombing, but they're part of the global jihadist movement. They're part of a movement that has a certain ideology, that has certain aims, that sees the world and sees the religion in the way that you described. And that ideology is problematic. And we have to be very clear. So it's not even just about being against terrorism. Yeah, no one wants innocent people to be killed. It's really, if we want to stop the Al-Qaedas and the ISIS, we really have to call out this movement. The jihadist movement, how they see jihad. And that's something that gets missed if we're not willing to point at the ideology or name it or specify it. The only thing I'll add, though, is I'll say coming from the intelligence community, though, a lot of the debate over language, I would say, is less pronounced because I honestly feel that, especially in the early days, yes, there was some debate about Islam. In the first few years, I think the intelligence community was trying to figure out, well, how do we see all of this, and listening to different scholars. But for the most part, within the intelligence community, people use precise language. I can't talk about when things after I left, but when I was there, Islamism, within, in terms of an intelligence product, if you're writing something, Islamist group, jihadist groups, that's the language that we used. We call it what it is. Now, I know it's different out in the public. So there is a difference there. That was sort of classified.
That was among yourselves more than it was for public consumption. It was, okay.
Because you're talking about what's going on and how are we going to fight it and how are we, what is our analysis of it. So there wasn't, jihadist was not a banned term at all within the intelligence community, at least where I was.
And there's so much I want to talk about, and we're running a little low on time. But if you're sitting down as an intelligence agent or as a Muslim with a Salafi jihadist, and he is saying to you, no, Yaya, you got it wrong. You've been influenced by the infidels. Mm-hmm. You're part of the problem, and which may mean he's going to debate you, or may mean he's going to kill you, because as you know, and a lot of people don't, the Salafi jihadists don't want to just kill infidels; they want to kill those they see as having strayed from the religion. That's out there. Mm-hmm. And he says you have to fight jihad. That's your religious obligation. If you do not understand that, you do not understand Islam. What do you respond?
I would point to him to even the sources that he's using for his argument. I would come back to him with the sources, but from a very different perspective. So here's the thing. The debate against the counter argument for jihadists lies in the Quran and the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad itself. I would point out what he's doing. He is making an analogy between, let's say, Muhammad's fight against the Meccans who were non-Muslim, the polytheists of the Quraysh, the tribes of Mecca, and his fight of today. And I would say, if you look at the Quran, in the Quran, it says that Muhammad, and I'd use language that he would know. So I'd use I'd use Arabic terms where it says Muhammad is the best uswa, and that term uswa means a pattern of conduct. People use the term sunnah, which means example, but that's not the Quranic term that applies to Muhammad. The Quranic term, it says that Muhammad has the best example pattern. Well, it's better translated as a pattern of conduct. Uswa means like how you were fashioned, how something is, it's almost like not the blueprint, but it's the inner, pattern of something. And it doesn't say sunnah. Not that the sunnah is not important. And I would say that shows you that Muhammad for us is a model of character and internal, an internal model that we should be following. It does not say that it does not say that he is a carbon copy that we imitate. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's just one idea. I would look at the concepts that I'd say he's perverting or that his interpretation is off, and I would show through Quranic reasoning how his interpretation does not necessarily hold up. And the thing is, and I'm actually happy to, I think I've matured in my 40 some years where I don't feel like everyone's going to believe my interpretation or my approach, but I'm fine with conveying and countering based on what I understand.
And this is something people don't understand. I think on the right and the left, is that there have been these arguments within Islam for centuries. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they've been debates. Sometimes they've been wars over these things. I mean, it's not always, op-eds and, and forums for debates at the school setting at all over how much you have to take on faith and how much you're allowed to use critical thinking and reasoning to come to your conclusions. That's been a real important debate. Mm-hmm. The Salafi jihadists might say, well, yeah, you're innovating and you've gone too far. You're not allowed to do that. But on what basis does he say that? What is within the realm of Quranic thinking and what is beyond that realm? Mm-hmm. And part of what I'm getting at is you have both those on the right who say, I agree. Essentially, they're saying, I agree with the Salafi jihadists. That's the only interpretation of Islam that makes any sense. That's why all Muslims must be suspect and all Muslims are untrustworthy, because there is only this one interpretation. Mm-hmm. And then there are those on the left who are saying, oh, no, that's not even Islam at all. It's a perverted version of Islam. Yeah. Neither is true, but you're walking an intellectual tightrope if you try to make that argument, which we are trying to make. I think you're trying to make it. I think I'm trying to make it. I don't know if we're getting it across to people who are listening. Yeah. But it is an intellectual tightrope to say, no, there are these various. Look, if you look, I'm going to say one more thing, I'll let you go. If you look at the realm of Islam, you have Ismailis. Once upon a time, they were very violent. Nowadays, they're not. You have Ahmadis. They're considered heretics because they go too far by the view of most other Muslims. You have Sufis. Once again, very violent in the past, not particularly so nowadays. I mean, we can go on and on with the different groups, and it's hard for people to distinguish among all this. And it takes a lot of study. People don't have time. But that's the thing. It's a matter of interpretation, which also brings us to this point that I do want to get in here. People talk about radicalization as if it's a disease that you catch. And if we're accepting that there are these various interpretations, from ones that are absolutely militant and violent and hostile to non-believers and to people like you who believe somewhat differently, you understand what I'm trying to get at. Let me let you take it from there.
There's this phenomenon. I think you're familiar with it, where people will often say, well, those terrorists, they're not Muslims,
Right.
and I gotta beg to differ there. There's this idea of trying to trying to negate the fact that Osama bin Laden, he was Muslim. I mean, I don't think he was a good Muslim, right? We have to accept that and that's maybe the catch-22 is that we can't say that, this is just this one skewed view and that it's so far from what anyone believes. No, it's actually linked to, there's people, even if they're not on the bin Laden spectrum, there's, unfortunately some sympathy because we don't really focus on, we're not clear about what we're dealing with. I would say, bin Laden was a Muslim. We have to really accept the fact that these folks are here. They're within our midst. They're not aliens. Yes, they're not the majority, and the violent folks are not the majority, but we have to accept that obviously what they're saying has some resonance. And so how do we get to, there's the question, and maybe this is what you're getting at, the idea of the root of the problem. Can we solve the root? Right. What are the root causes? And I guess my response to that is, this idea root is singular. And that doesn't make sense. This is not a singular thing. We're not going to, implement one program and one policy and then the Muslim, world's going to, be waving the American flag. Radicalization is complex and complicated because the human psyche is complex. And so what I say is we're not going to have some policy to just solve all of this, but what we should do as smart people, let's sort of isolate what the problems are. What are the building blocks that maybe we can impact? What are the things that as a Muslim I should be doing and talking to my Muslim, brothers and sisters about doing, if I don't want this narrative to resonate? What are the practical things that we could do and need to do?
And not think of Salafi jihadism or radicalism as simply, the product of poverty or simply the product of a lost opportunity or something that a foreign aid program can solve. It's just not quite that simple. Because you can become radicalized, but again, it's not, you can embrace a violent, a militant interpretation of Islam if you're living in Ghana, if you're living in London, if you're living in Paris, if you're living in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Any of those places, and you can be as wealthy as bin Laden or absolutely dirt poor in some village in Upper Egypt.
And I agree. And maybe the one other thing I'll say to this is a lot of those comments about, we'll solve through poverty or whatever, they don't deal with, well, then what is the competing ideology? What should it be? And I'm not naive to think that there's going to be one great, I'm going to come up with the right Islam. And if everyone just practiced Yaya's Islam, then there'd be no, jihadism. It's not that. But I do think we have to realize that the jihadists have a powerful narrative. They have, glory, mission. They have something that is strong, right? So we shouldn't think that in the absence of an alternative vision that gets propagated, in the absence of that we're going to make any headway. So it also means that there's going to have to be a competing narrative that I'd say Muslims have to convey, which speaks to it speaks to the human psyche and all these things, but that I think is more in tune with the spirit of the religion that I came to know.
My last question is going to be, we only have a few minutes left, but it's a practical example of what you're saying, which is somebody about, Anwar alAwlaqi, right? Because he was an American citizen. He was long regarded by the government and by the media as a moderate Islamic cleric. He was a Muslim chaplain at George Washington University. The New York Times described him as representing a new generation of Muslim leader capable of merging East and West. And of course, as you know well, but I'll remind the audience, he turned out to be a senior al-Qaeda leader, propagandist, recruiter, whom the U.S. assassinated using a Hellfire missile in 2011. Just talk a little bit about him and his journey, which you learned a lot about and know a lot about.
Yes, quite an interesting note to perhaps end on. alAwlaqi is a very good case to help us understand the resonance of the jihadist message, and his own journey too. Tells us quite a bit. So. I fell into looking at alAwlaqi in I think around 2007. It was interesting because alAwlaqi was in a Yemeni prison at some point. He was an American Islam, imam, and eventually he left. And there's, I don't know how much detail we want to get into, so I'll keep it brief. Right. He left, and once he left, he spouted moderate views. I mean, I believe he denied he denounced 9/11 when it happened. Okay, so he was not preaching hell and brimstone for America in those initial years. He had his own transformation, especially when he left, and he was in Yemen. And he had a very strong following on the internet. alAwlaqi is the product. His timing is very interesting because he gained prominence as a preacher, not initially for jihadist talks. He actually would have volumes of lectures on the life of the Prophet and history of the companions, all this stuff. He had a following already, and it's very long sort of scholarly speeches and the like. And his speeches were on the internet, and you could download them and everything. And so alAwlaqi is interesting because in 2007, when he was released from a prison, he started a series of moves to try to start to influence Westerners. And he started blogging. He started going on radio shows, internet radio shows. And I noticed him. So basically he came on my radar because I saw, wow, alAwlaqi's out of prison. What is he doing? All in open source. He's doing interviews. He basically started to present himself as someone who could help young Western Muslims understand their role. And his message was, the West is not for you Muslims. And look at what America is doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. The West is against Islam and it is your duty. And he did some very tricky things. He really knew what would resonate. And this is maybe the lesson we need to get. He knew that in the story of Islam, a key moment was this idea of migration, hijrah. The Islamic calendar starts with this idea with the Muslims leaving Mecca for Medina. And he pointed to that as an analog, right? The idea of an analogy of between the Prophet's life and what you as a Muslim in the West should do. If you're in a place that's hostile to Islam, like America or Britain, you need to go to where you can freely practice your religion somewhere else, like Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia. And he made this comparison. So it was a real crafty way of drawing the links between the scripture and the early Islamic history and today's conditions. So he did that, and he recruited Westerners and people from Nigeria, Brits. He recruited people from all over the world, and he joined Al-Qaeda. So there's so much there. So in terms of my looking at him, so I covered him as he was doing this, and I basically pointed out within the intelligence community and with the work that we did, our analysis, I pointed out that he was recruiting. He was positioning himself specifically to recruit Westerners with a very targeted message. Now here's a lesson too about the limits of intelligence and the limits of counterterrorism. 2007. We were pointing this out. We were pointing out what alAwlaqi was doing. So it's not like no one knew what he was doing. He was inspired. He was playing this role, but he continued to do this. So it lets you know that there are even limits to what we can stop. Of course, he met his end, as you described, but he still lives on in terms of his speeches and his thinking. So this is an ongoing sort of long war.
It's indeed a long war. Look, this has been fascinating. We've gone on long, but I think it's been worth it, certainly for me, and I hope for the audience. I think, you've given us a great deal to think about, certainly for me. I hope we're going to continue this discussion for many, many times, because we'll have much to talk about, and also get at some point to your research and analysis and the complex but very vital national security threats that you address in your work, that you do make accessible to people like me and a lot of others, so we can do that as well. So until then, thanks to you, and thanks to all those listening. We're looking forward to being with you again here on Foreign Podicy. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Foreign Podicy. As always, find and subscribe to our show on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. If you like this week's episode and have feedback for us, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'd appreciate your thoughts and your criticisms, too. We hope you'll join us again in the future, but until then, I'm Cliff May, and you've been listening to Foreign Podicy.